Labor organizing is an ongoing movement that began in the 1600s. It grew out of the need to protect and organize the rights of workers laboring in poor conditions. During this movement, workers have fought and won many luxuries we enjoy today: 8-hour workdays, 40-hour weeks, overtime, healthcare, pensions, and safer conditions, to name a few. The Anti-Sweatshop movement began in the 1890s and is one component of the labor movement. This will be the focus of our presentation.
A scene of horror at a clothing factory that went up in flames, workers trapped inside. The factory is in Bangladesh, but the clothes they make are for international companies, some of those companies American, allegedly including Walmart. ABC's chief investigative correspondent.
The incident in Rana Plaza was the worst in the garment industry to occur, but in order to understand the context of the situation, a historical framework from 100 years ago is needed. Beginning in the 1700s, the child labor movement was established. Children worked long hours in factories with unsafe working conditions. With the growth of cities and the rise of urbanization, children were thought of as property to be utilized in factories. By 1810, about 2 million school-aged children were working 50 to 70-hour weeks. Collective movements pushed for reforms, and child labor laws began to come about. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted. This protected many children, but failed to protect rural, orphan, and children in freed Black families who still labored long hours. This movement is important to highlight because it planted the idea that having younger individuals work in harsh conditions for lower wages would attribute to the economic growth of Western societies.
A following pivotal point in the labor movement took place in New York. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 was one of the deadliest industrial accidents to occur in U.S. history. 146 workers died in the tragedy, the youngest victim age 14. Since the factory locked the exits to the building to prevent theft and excessive breaks, workers could not leave and eventually perished in the fire. Some workers even jumped to their deaths from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors so that their families could identify their bodies. Most of the victims were recent Jewish and Italian immigrant women aged 16 to 23. As noted by Bob Ross in his work Slaves for Fashion, the fire of 1911 stirred the conscience of the city of New York and the state. The middle and upper class reformers who were thus inspired learned, in the next generation, to work with politicians based in immigrant working class communities. The result, eventually, was the public policy half of the solution. Both parts, the workers' own unions and the political reforms, are central to the story of the ascent to decency for garment workers.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was a pivotal moment in the fight against sweatshops. Outraged and mourning the loss of their fellow workers, survivors gathered together at union headquarters to demand change and take a plan of action. The fire made it painstakingly clear the need for a collective movement. Because most of the workers were recent immigrants, they could not refuse to work in unsafe working conditions or stand up to the owners without the risk of losing these jobs that they most desperately needed. The Shirtwaist Fire made people realize the importance of creating a strong, solid community over individual action, and was the catalyst for union formation.
Over the course of the next 100 years, globalization has shifted the apparel industry from production in the US to various countries around the world. In 1960, 90% of the clothing worn by Americans was made in America. In 1999, that number was down to 50%, and today it is less than 2%. Companies continue to evade accountability by producing in subcontracted factories.
Well, Scott, sometimes American companies give their orders to a supplier, not the factory. Or they'll give an order to one factory and then it gets passed along to another factory. In that case, they don't know where their products are being made. And even if they do know which factory they're using and they inspect it, there can still be problems because the factories are cleaned up ahead of the inspection and workers are coached on what to say.
The garment industry, consisting of 4,500 textile factories, is crucial to Bangladesh's economy. This industry accounts for 80% of their manufacturing. The country exports $20 billion worth of garments and employs 4 million workers. It is the second largest apparel exporter in the world, behind China. While the industry is booming, Bangladesh has the lowest labor costs in the world. Workers on average make $38 per month for 15-hour shifts in the sweatshop environment. Not only are workers paid the lowest minimum wage in the world, but they work in some of the poorest conditions due to the lack of regulations. In the last 8 years, over 1,800 Bangladeshi garment workers have died in building collapses and factory fires.
The worst incident in the history of the garment industry occurred April 24, 2013. The Rana Plaza factory collapse killed 1,132 workers. Around 300 shops were in the building, with 4 garment factories on the higher levels. These factories are New Wave Bottoms, Phantom Apparels, Phantom Tack, and Ether Textile. New Wave supplies to major Western retailers, including the U.S., and Ether claims to supply to Walmart, though it is denied by the colossal U.S. giant. What has been done to provide justice to the families of the lost? The government promised monetary compensation of $1,250 in cash and $19,000 in savings certificates, but has yet to give most of the money to the families. Sums from $1,250 to $5,000 were given to 777 families, but this is significantly less than the total killed. For an event that was the largest in history, the action that resulted on behalf of the government is less than satisfactory.
The information presented relates to CASC in multiple facets, one of which is the struggle for equal rights for women. Many women work in the poor conditions available in factories for low pay and are treated as having a lower social status. Labor laws and labor movements are working to restore the power that was stripped away from them when they were hired to work long hours in unsuitable conditions. This also applies to the concept of power and privilege. As Americans, we sport any apparel that we desire, but less than 2% is produced in America. Essentially, we are wearing the products constructed by hands that are not receiving the monetary benefits that they are entitled to. Hierarchically, as a nation, we place ourselves in a superior position because we are benefiting from their toil. Furthermore, this information connects to the idea of community. Employees in sweatshops are their own community of immigrant and working class individuals, but they are connected to our communities in the Western world through the goods that they produce. We are also connected through the Anti-Sweatshop movement. Groups on U of M's campus, like United Students Against Sweatshops, are partnering with workers in sweatshops in solidarity to form coalitions and change capitalist infrastructures. Finally, the anti-sweatshop movement is looked at through the framework of Marxism. Marx's labor theory of value explains that the specific form of labor characteristic of bourgeois society, wage labor, corresponds to the most profound form of alienation. Because wage workers sell their labor power to earn a living, and the capitalist owns the labor process, the product of the worker's labor is alien to the worker. It is not his or her product, but the product of the capitalist. The most important relation of the work of the anti-sweatshop and overall labor movement is that the work is never finished. Despite the attention given the incident in Rana Plaza, there was another fire in a different factory in Ghazipur, Bangladesh that killed 10 workers. One would assume that all of the issues regarding sweatshops would be cured. The worst incident in the garment industry happened 6 months ago. The second worst occurred over 100 years ago at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. When will these senseless tragedies end? This is an ongoing, active process to foster change in the labor movement. Through collective liberation, our diverse identities and experiences provide us with the tools to dismantle systems of economic and social oppression and create a world where equity and unity and freedom ring true.